Hi, everybody. Welcome to this month's IA Proficiency Club meeting. Today, we've got some exciting things we're going to talk about. We're going to start by talking about some great news here at Independence Aviation. Then we're going to get into talking about landings, talking about our approaches, our approach speed, and kind of the pilot mentality that goes into everything that is your approach and landing. As we get started here right at 6 o'clock, the text is going out. Everybody is getting in, getting logged on. If you guys can do me a favor, make sure that your mics are muted throughout the night. That would be excellent. We are going to start this evening by talking about questions and answers. If you guys have questions, I certainly want to get those answered. And therefore, what I want you guys to do, if you have questions as we're going through, if you need me to slow down, if you need me to speed up because I'm telling you things that you already know, put that input there in the comment section or in the Q&A section that's there on your Google Meets tab under the menu. Any questions so far? Not yet. My name is Ian. I'm a Platinum CSIP as well as a Vision Jet instructor pilot for Cirrus Aircraft. I'm also your host for this 2026 IA Proficiency Club season. As we go through this season, the big picture that I want you guys to keep in mind is that we're always going to be talking about that difference between being safe and feeling safe. Sometimes we are safe, but we don't feel that way, and therefore we don't fly that way. And sometimes we feel safe, but we aren't actually safe. And we're going to talk about a lot of that tonight. This season, what we want to be thinking about is defining your personal minimums, creating a box with those personal minimums, and then staying inside of that box, keeping you safe. We're also expanding that box of personal minimums with intention, not just going out and throwing ourselves into a 30-knot crosswind because Joe Bob said, oh, you'll be fine. We'll start with some good news. Independence Aviation won Training Center of the Year in a large market. Congratulations to everybody, the instructors, to the back office, to everyone. It took a year-long effort to get the recognition from Cirrus that we are the best in the nation. Tonight's agenda, like I was talking about, we're going to be talking primarily about approaches and landings, okay? One of the big problems that we have in general aviation is coming in too fast, going around and crashing our aircraft. As you guys pay attention to everything that happened in the world of Cirrus, you've seen a high-profile go-around accident. We see the FlyStow data that shows us that even in our fleet, especially up here in the Denver area, we're coming in too fast. We're coming in with too much energy. And as a result, a go-around that doesn't go well can end in an accident. We're talking about everything that goes into that. We're talking about lift, energy management, and really what that is control of the aircraft and some of the physics behind it that we don't always think about because we think of aerodynamics that we're also going to talk about. And then we're going to talk about stalls. Really, as we talk about stalls and as I make this unfounded statement that just pops into my instructor brain, I guess I can say in my professional opinion, what has happened in general aviation is we as instructors, I know my instructors before me, have said, don't go slow. Don't go slow. You're going to stall. You get too slow. You stall. You crash. And therefore, as a general audience of flight instructors, we've all started coming in not just at that recommended VREF or 1.3 times stall speed. We've started giving a couple extra knots to keep your wife happy, to keep your husband happy, to keep your mom and dad happy as we go out and fly. we keep adding a buffer and a buffer and a buffer. And what we're seeing is people are coming in at 90, even 100 knots, crossing the threshold with too much energy, too much airspeed, resulting in what is the potential for an accident. Okay. So at the end of all of this, we're going to talk about those go-arounds. And one of the things that I always tell my students, that with everybody that I work with, is that there are two types of go-arounds. There are good go-arounds and there are scary go-arounds. There's no such thing as a bad go-around, but there's good decisions that we can make early that make it a good go-around versus getting ourselves in way too deep and then having to fly ourselves out of that with skill alone. So I'm going to start tonight with a question. I said we're going to start with, I don't know, I don't think I said we're going to start with aerodynamics, but we'll start with a little bit of aerodynamics, just a general aviation question. And I want you guys to take a couple seconds to think about this. You can give your answer in the Q&A chat, but if I were to take an SR-20 and put it on a gigantic treadmill, and I accelerate that treadmill up to 77 knots, and I have the aircraft engine pulling the aircraft at 77 knots, meaning that the wheel speed is spinning at 77 knots. If I pull back on that stick, will the aircraft rotate? Will I fly up into the air? I can give you guys a hint. There's a reason that we don't have a bunch of treadmills at our airports. There's a reason that we don't do this, but I want you to take a second to think about why. For a few of you, or maybe for a lot of you, I know that you know somewhere in your head that, no, this isn't going to work out, but I don't entirely know why. Some of you have already said, if I accelerate to 77 knot wheel speed without actually accelerating in relation to the air, I'm not going anywhere. So as we talk about some of our airfoils and aerodynamics, any questions about that treadmill exercise? Good. Everybody got it. I probably spent too long talking about it. You guys are all really smart. Sometimes we flight instructors forget just how smart you are. And so we like to hear ourselves talk and go in way too deep. We're going to start by talking about airfoils and aerodynamics. This is the calculation of lift. Lift is equal to 1/2 of the air density times the velocity squared times the surface area of the wing times the lift coefficient, which the lift coefficient is essentially determined by your angle of attack. Now, I bring this up not because I want anybody to do math, and I will not be doing math for you in public, but as we look at the things that go into the calculation of lift, what actually creates lift? We can look at the S, the surface area of the wing, and if you want a bigger wing surface area, you have to fly a different airplane. That's how that works. We have no control over it. The density of the air is another thing that, unless you're a scientist in a controlled environment, you have no control over. So the two big things that we're looking at in the calculation of lift is velocity relative to the air and our angle of attack. And as we talk tonight about lift and landing and aerodynamics and everything else, what I want you guys constantly thinking about is, how do I control the amount of lift being produced? Controlling the amount of lift being produced is essentially our job as a pilot. And aerodynamically speaking, that's one way of looking at it. That's a very common way of looking at our job, is maintaining an angle of attack and maintaining our thrust lever, which is producing more or less lift, putting us higher or lower relative to the earth. Okay. As we jump into some of the aerodynamics of an approach, an instrument approach or a VFR approach doesn't really matter, but as we look at lift, we've got a couple different airfoils on the aircraft, right? I would take this time to ask you what they are, but I realized that I put them up on the slide, and so you can see the main ones that I'm talking about here on the aircraft. Okay, the propeller is an airfoil that's creating the high and low pressure differential, that's creating that thrust that's pulling the aircraft through the air. Our vertical stab back here is essentially an entirely uniform airfoil that, while it does produce lift as we fly through the air, is producing equal amount of lifts depending on which side that we throw it into the air, and you guys understand. Our wings that we're talking about mostly, as we increase and decrease our angle of attack, which we're going to talk about, we're increasing and decreasing the amount of lift. We can also increase or decrease that amount of lift simply by throwing more air over the wings. As I talk about throwing air over the wings, of course, I'm not talking about bringing the air to the wing. I'm talking about bringing the aircraft through the air mass, increasing or decreasing the amount of lift. That last one, the horizontal stabilizer. I'm not talking about the elevator back here. I'm talking about the horizontal stabilizer. It also produces lift, but it produces lift in the opposite direction of our wings. That creates what's called dynamic stability of the aircraft. Okay, so as we're flying along, if we simply pull the thrust lever back, we decrease our aircraft going through the air and the amount of air going over the wing. We're going to decrease lift, but we're also going to decrease the tail down force that's happening on that horizontal stabilizer. Okay, now I realize as I talk about this, a lot of us understand it. Some of us learning to land, maybe this is new to you. Maybe this is something you're going to go over with your instructor. But what I want for everybody to do is think about what that means for our aircraft as we come in on an approach. Because what I often see is I'm watching people fly in the simulator, or as I'm sitting in the right seat, watching the stick and throttle out of my peripherals as I'm watching the horizon coming in, is I see the stick move, and I don't see the throttle move, and then I see the throttle move, and I don't see the stick move. We're catching up to the aerodynamics of the aircraft. We're making one input, which is good. Some people use pitch for airspeed and throttle for altitude, or vice versa as we're coming in on an approach. And those are great ways to learn to fly. But as you get more and more advanced, if we think and we try and stay ahead of the aircraft, what we're doing really is a throttle input and a pitch input that we know through experience only. And I wish I could tell you how much pitch and how much power, but that's what makes you guys pilots. Anytime that we're in on an approach and we need a large power change, we should be adjusting our elevator as well. The elevator is what gives us ultimate control over that angle of attack, aerodynamically speaking, without doing anything. When we increase our throttle, we're increasing the amount of lift produced on the tail in a downward direction, therefore pulling up the nose. So make sure that you guys are staying on top of this on your approaches. Make sure that you're staying ahead of the aircraft. Anytime that we're putting in a thrust, anytime that we are making a throttle change, we know that that's going to adjust the pitch of the nose. With that said as well, sometimes we see some throttle jockeying, especially as we come up in the winds. If we don't need to go all the way from 75% of power to 25% of power, we're then not going to need to take the stick and make the nose do all of this. Notice I'm rotating the tail, not rotating the nose. We'll talk more about that as well, right? But the aircraft then starts doing this as it's flying through the air, coming down in a constantly changing energy state, adding more variables. So make sure that you guys are staying ahead of that. Our angle of attack, as we're talking about managing that angle of attack of our main wings, we don't think about managing the angle of attack of our horizontal stabilizer. But as we're talking about managing that angle of attack, a quick review for most: leading edge, trailing edge, upper camber, lower camber. Our chord line runs. If we could bisect this wing and cut it off, I'd break it off, but somebody'd probably yell at me. If we could bisect this wing so that it was one solid piece and we do a straight line from the leading edge to the trailing edge, that makes up our angle of attack. As you can see in this image, as we increase our angle of attack without increasing airspeed, we increase lift. Another way to do this, if we stopped the aircraft right here and we simply increased the speed of the air going over the wings by increasing the throttle and going faster, we're also going to increase the lift being produced and we're going to go up. Now, these are all things, as I talk about, good things to think about while here on the ground. When you're in the aircraft, please don't be thinking about the calculation for how much lift your wing is producing. We're simply flying the aircraft by managing all of these pieces all at once. Any questions so far? This all makes sense to you guys, is what I'm taking from that. So like I said, This is just my professional opinion on how we got to the place that we are, where we are coming in far too fast on our approaches. Really, at the base of all of this is a fear of stalling and a fear of death, which rightfully so. But if we understand why an aircraft stalls and how an aircraft stalls and when we're likely to stall, we're much less likely to come in. So I want to take a couple seconds to talk about stalls, not just because we're getting close to a stall while landing, or even potentially stalling while landing, which we'll talk about. But I want to talk about how an aircraft stalls, why it stalls, and all of that. So as I go through, when I used to be the chief here at Independence Aviation, I would do CFI interviews. And one of the questions that I'd ask first and foremost, and I kind of knew how the rest of the interview was going to go, is I'd ask, when does an aircraft stall? And if I heard the words, when it gets too slow, I would know that the rest of the CFI interview probably wasn't going to go well. Now, for those of you out there who think, well, yeah, it does stall when it gets too slow, you're right. It does stall when it gets slow enough, and especially when we're in a known configuration and a known attitude, we can pretty reliably get the aircraft to reach, and what I'm talking about is that critical angle of attack at the same speed every time. But that's not when the aircraft stalls. The aircraft stalls when we reach the critical angle of attack, and when we reach that critical angle of attack, as you see in this looping video, airflow separates from the top of the wing, and that's what creates the reduction almost completely in lift. Okay, so by reaching that critical angle of attack, we stall the aircraft. Does that make sense to everybody? I see some nods. I pose to you this question then. As we see this looping video of an aircraft looping, how does that work? Does the wing of that 4-engine aircraft not exceed the critical angle of attack, especially there as you see it getting up to 90 degrees? How? Why? Are we, in fact, reaching that critical angle of attack as we go through and loop? Anybody care to answer my questions, or am I just talking to space? You know, I really like hearing myself talk, but I'd appreciate if you guys would drop an answer to my questions. If you're deep in thought, that's okay too. I don't want to interrupt you as you think through these things. As I now ramble on, giving you guys a couple seconds to think about this. A few of you already know, a few of you have thought about what that critical angle of attack is of the looping aircraft, and a few of you may say, well, yeah, it just does stall, and then it comes up and it loops around. Unfortunately, there is a right and wrong answer in this, and that would be the wrong answer, that it just uses sheer momentum as we get into talking about kinetic energy. As an aircraft goes through and does a loop, what we're doing is increasing the angle of attack of the aircraft. By increasing that angle of attack, we're bringing the nose up, we're using our elevator to come through, and our angle of attack reaches probably about 10 degrees nose up. And we think, well, yeah, if it increases any more and we go to 90 degrees, we exceeded that around 14-degree angle of attack that causes us to stall, so why isn't it stalling? And the answer comes not in exceeding the critical angle of attack, because the angle of attack is the chord line to the relative wind. Right? So as I tilt this aircraft up and over, we know that as we fly through the air normally straight and level, our relative wind is coming parallel to the earth, because most of the time that's how we fly. As I initiate a climb, though, in pitching the nose up, where is that relative wind coming from? Right? It's important to note that the aircraft isn't simply rotating on a dime, it's coming up through the air. And whether it be the thrust or our momentum through the air that pulls us all the way up and around, our angle of attack as we're vertical is no longer coming from here. We've vectored that around, and it's followed the aircraft through that turn, so that by the time we get to 90 degrees, we're still at about a 10-degree angle of attack, right? And I can bring this to the front wing here. As we come up and over, right, our angle of attack as we're then upside down and inverted in the aircraft is coming from here. As we keep that angle of attack to the relative wind down and we're inverted, that angle of attack is still pulling the nose down and through. And as we complete that loop, we have never exceeded the critical angle of attack because of the relative wind hitting the wing. Does that make sense to everybody? As we think, well, why is this guy talking about stalls, right? I thought we were going to talk about landings. Our stalls, as we're coming in on approaches, we're reducing our energy. We're getting towards that stalling angle of attack, though we may never actually reach it in the landing, right? And it's important to note that it's not just getting slow that causes you to stall. If we're coming through sinking air and we think about where that air is coming, we're coming towards an air mass at an angle. If our angle is about 3 degrees down to the runway, where is our relative air? Well, it's coming from 3 degrees to the runway. So if I pull back on that stick, am I likely to stall at only 2.5 degrees nose up? Now at 3 degrees, probably not, right? But if I'm trying to maintain this descent coming in and I'm pulling the nose up, I'm going to see the airspeed decrease. But the point of this is not just I need to keep my speed up. It's I need to think about how I am approaching the runway. If I have wind shear that comes through, if I have vertical wind shear or turbulence that comes through, that can drastically change my angle of attack, and we may hear the stall warning horn go off. We may run into that stall. As we're thinking about our approach, it's not that you shouldn't pay attention to airspeed. It's not that you shouldn't pay attention to your AOA indicator if you're coming in. It's just thinking about, well, when is the aircraft actually going to stall and when am I actually in danger while I'm in the aircraft? Most of the time, we are safe. We just don't feel safe, especially as we watch that airspeed go from 80 to 79 or 80 to 78. We go, oh, I got to get going faster. Then we increase our airspeed, not just compensating for those 2 knots that we lost, but we're looking at 85, 90 knots and going, oh, I can't believe that I got slower than 80 knots. That's not what's important. What's important is that we're managing the energy of the aircraft as we're coming in. I posed to you another question. This aircraft that's almost vertical, can it stall? Probably doing close to 170, 180 knots based on the picture and the way that I can see it. I'm making that up. But if I'm doing 200 knots straight down, is it possible for the aircraft to stall? The answer comes once again in the relative angle of attack. If I pull out slowly, my relative air is down here. My angle of attack is up at about that 10 degrees, which once again, I'm just making up 10 degrees. And as I do that, the nose pulls out just like it did as we came through in that loop. However, at 150 knots, if I'm coming down this way, if the energy of the aircraft is coming this way, and I yank back, where is my angle of attack then? Well, if I pitch to 90 degrees, it's the same thing in reverse where we are stalling. Even though we're parallel to the Earth, our relative air is still coming up, and therefore the wing is in a full stall, and we will continue to fall through the air. Does anybody have any questions about accelerated stalls? This all makes sense. So let's talk about this approach speed, right? Here I've pulled out of, I believe, an SR22 turbo, the bottom of the white arc. The bottom of the white arc being 64 knots. 1.3 times 64 is going to be right around 80. Now, this is the most adverse condition. As we talk about aircraft weight and we talk about the aircraft coming in different configurations, flaps 50, flaps full, different weights, VREF may move around. Okay. Our stall speed may move around. Once again, we're not stalling because we're at that speed. We're simply know that on an approach, we're going to reach our critical angle of attack at about 64 knots. So what do? We increase that speed that we come in at so that we're not just hanging out on that stalling angle of attack and hoping that we fly our way all the way down to the ground. Okay. So 80 knots, 80 knots, 80 knots is what we hear when we're flaps full. We hear 85 when we're flaps 50. We hear 90 knots when we're flaps up. Those configuration changes are going to change the speed at which we should come in on our approach. 1.3 times, if we come in at 80 knots, we're looking at a 16 knot buffer between our stall, or our stall speed, where we are likely to stall, and our approach speed. Think about the last time that you were flying and even some turbulence or some wind shear. When's the last time you saw the airspeed indicator just rob you of 14 knots without any indication by the seat of your pants flying, or any indication by our visual reference to the horizon, or any indication whatsoever on our instrument panel? If we're flying around in those conditions where we might lose 16 knots instantly, we're thinking, all right, should I be in there? Or at that point, when we've got large gusts, when we've got wind shear, then we might start adding a couple knots. But a couple knots, right? Half of our gust factor of 10 would be 5, so we'd come in at 85 knots. Is not 90, is not 95, and it's certainly not 100. The other thing is we keep coming through and we talk about our energy management. Okay? Our energy management is planning altitude and airspeed, which is really what goes into all the energy that we're making in this aircraft. Managing our mechanical energy, which is the total of our potential and our kinetic energy. And as I get using some of these scientific words and throwing equations at you guys, once again, I don't do math unless I have to. I can't do this kind of, well, I guess I probably could, but I'm not going to. And I don't want you focused on thinking about these things when you're flying. I want you premeditating them, thinking about them now, and then taking these into the flying that you do as you're coming in on an approach. As we're talking about mechanical energy, we're talking about our total potential energy as well as our kinetic energy. So essentially our altitude and our airspeed. Energy management is all about focusing on our flight control and how we are controlling the aircraft that we're going to talk about. And it is separate from the performance and efficiency considerations. So as we talk about energy, we're not talking about how much fuel we're consuming. We're not talking about our engine. We're simply talking about the raw physics of landing. As we come through and we look at potential versus kinetic energy, potential energy is the amount of energy due to the altitude expressed. M is the airplane's mass, G is gravitation, and H is altitude, right? Potential energy is essentially the way that gravity is going to react with an object. As we're in the aircraft, we're talking about being up at altitudes and creating lots of stored energy because we always have gravity that can bring us down. That gravity that can bring us down means airflow over the wings, i.e. the aircraft moving through the air. So we're still creating lift using stored energy instead of just our engine, right? Gliders do this. They have to get up there somehow. They have to create the potential energy by getting the altitude, but then as they fly through the air, they're able to use that stored energy to take them down and through. Kinetic energy, then, as we're talking about the kinetic energy of the aircraft, we're just talking about the airspeed, right? What I want you to think about when we think about kinetic energy is and I know that this probably isn't very pleasant to think about, but as we're flying through the air, if our wings were to disappear, where would the aircraft go? This is how we're talking about the aircraft in relation to the angle of attack. This is how we're talking about where is our energy going in the aircraft. So as we think about that in a turn, as our aircraft is turning through the air, our vector is constantly changing as we're getting pulled. We're increasing our angle of attack in order to pull us through that turn. If our wings were to disappear as we were going through a turn, would we keep that turn going down to the ground? No. If our wings were to disappear, the aircraft would go wherever that energy was pulling us at the time of that turn, right? And it's going to be the same thing as we think about our landings, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. I'm going to bring the treadmill back as we talk about energy, specifically kinetic energy, as well as the potential energy. But as we think about this treadmill during landing, how does that change? Why don't we have big treadmills at airports that bring us to a stop on the runway? As you guys ponder that, I'll ask again, do we have any questions? Not at all. If you guys have answers to the question, why can't we use a treadmill? You could maybe test to make sure that the Q&A works, if that makes you curious. If it doesn't, you don't have to. As we take a look at this treadmill and we're running through our mind, why don't we just get the treadmill going at the same speed that we're coming in? We could pretty much come in at a full stop. Would that work? No. But why? Why wouldn't it work to get the treadmill? As we talk about energy and energy management, ultimately what we're doing while landing is controlling and depleting the potential energy that is stored up on our way down to the ground. When we think about our kinetic energy, our airspeed, we're thinking about coming down to the runway and then having a bunch of momentum that's still carrying us forward. So if we were to touch down on a treadmill, moving backward at the same speed that we were trying to land going forward, or our touchdown speed, really what we're talking about is increasing, once again, our wheel spin to 2 times what it would be having the reverse treadmill come forward and the aircraft come the opposite direction. But the aircraft is still going to move along that treadmill with all of its momentum forwards. If you think about it this way, even if you had a treadmill, if you were coming in at 62 knots and for some reason this worked, right? If you think about your body sitting inside of the aircraft coming to a stop, suddenly it doesn't sound very comfortable, right? We're talking about whiplash and other terrible things, okay? So as we're coming in and we're thinking about this energy management, one of the ways that you can picture this is a bouncy ball, right? When we're thinking about this energy management, what we're thinking about is depleting our total potential energy, as well as landing with the least amount of kinetic energy, right? And we're not talking about airspeed once we get on the ground, even though we are going to talk about airspeed when we get on the ground. What we're talking about is landing in the least amount of energy state as we possibly can. So as we're coming into land and we're touching down, what a lot of us are doing as we come in fast and looking at the 1,000-foot markers is we're coming down to the runway, crossing the threshold at 80, 90, even 100 knots sometimes, flying ourselves down to a level attitude over the runway. And as we find ourselves in level flight over the runway in ground effect, we're floating and we're floating and we're floating and we're saying, I don't want to float anymore. And so we either lower the nose or we keep it just level with the horizon. Now, some of us say, well, I like to land a little bit fast because I've got some more aerodynamic authority. I'm able to, the aircraft feels more controllable. But what I want you to think about as we take a look at our bouncy ball aircraft is the energy that we're landing with, okay? Now, unlike a bouncy ball, if we land with added potential energy and not enough kinetic energy in order to keep us flying through the air, i.e. keeping airflow over the wings, i.e. not stalling, we drop. And if you think about a bouncy ball, the bouncy ball will pop back up, right? And sometimes we get a porpoise or two if we land too high, but that's not really what causes our porpoising. What causes our porpoising is not the springiness of these wheels popping us back up into the air. It's the lift still being created by the wing. As we try and force the aircraft down to the ground, and we have an equal and opposite reaction of the aircraft coming down, the wheels touching down, and then that little bit of throw back up into the air, the wings are still producing enough lift to keep us in the air, and that's when we start to have those bounce landings. What we're looking for as we come in is for the aircraft to be about 5 degrees nose up. Now, why 5 degrees nose up? Because we know at 5 degrees nose up, we're going to keep the nose protected. We're not going to have a collapse, keep our propeller protected. We're not going to strike the nose or the tail on the ground, right? And we can do that anywhere between 5 and 7 degrees nose up. But what we know is at that landing attitude, we're going to touch our mains down first. It's also our ability to deplete as much of that kinetic energy as possible. And if we have some added potential energy when we deplete enough kinetic energy to come down, we get a little plunky, but that's okay, having an extra foot or two. If we're landing nose low, we see the aircraft come back up into the air. The worst thing we can do is pitch the nose forward, because it then bounces and starts to porpoise. Then we execute the go around, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Really, what we're looking at as we're depleting that energy, and we're talking about landing, we're talking about a single moment in time when the wheels touch the ground. And that's not what goes into a landing. What goes into a landing are the seconds before and the seconds after, how we manage our energy coming down to the runway, crossing the threshold, so that we can deplete it. As we talk about the bouncy ball and we talk about depleting the energy, what I want you guys to think about is not a single point in time where the wheels touch the ground as the landing, but I want you to think of that landing beginning at 500 feet before we come down to the runway and ending as we exit the runway. Okay? Now you may say, well, yeah, that's a long time, but the landing and the wheel touchdown is somewhat of a misnomer and somewhat of a misthought, because a landing does take all of that time that we are controlling the aircraft with its aerodynamic resources. Thanks for testing, Bryce. As we're coming down to the runway and we're thinking about that landing, one of the big things that I see constantly, especially in crosswind landings, is that people will come down, they'll touch down, and then they let go of the controls. As we think back to our private pilot training, or for those of you that are staying current and doing all of your training, as we think about a soft field takeoff, and we're accelerating down the runway, the nose pops up off the ground, and we're able to control our angle of attack while still being on the ground, while being sub 40 knots, 50 knots, right? We're able to pop that wheel up because we've got elevator authority. We're obviously controlling the directional control of the aircraft with our rudders. If we crab into the wind too early, we end up going off the side of the runway. But if we think about this crosswind landing, and we think about this landing as fully controlling the aircraft all the way to the touchdown, as opposed to a single moment in time when we land, we run ourselves out of the risk of a runway excursion. We run ourselves out of the risk of a runway accident, right? Or a landing accident, I should say. As we think about flying the aircraft all the way to the ground, what does that look like? You kind of say, well, yeah, man, I'm doing all this, or at least I'm trying to do all this. What am I doing? What are you trying to tell me that I'm doing wrong? And you're not doing anything wrong except the way that you think about the landings, most likely. If we think about our landings as flying the aircraft all the way to the ground and to a full stop, we're using all of our control surfaces the whole way through this process. What we're doing is we're getting rid of those landings where we come in and go, okay, there it is. We're getting rid of these landings where we come in, we land a little bit fast, and then we lose control of the aircraft because we kind of quit flying as soon as those mains touch down. What I would like to see you guys doing is keeping your crosswind correction in, keeping your elevator coming back and using your aerodynamic braking as well as your brakes as you come to a stop. Through doing all of this, what we're really doing is landing the lowest possible energy state. And in that state, should we have to go around maintaining positive control of the aircraft throughout the entire process, instead of coming down, losing control of the aircraft, and then having to regain it. I know when I was learning to land and even giving up the control, getting in the instructor's seat, that loss of control that we would feel when we or when another pilot would come down and kind of clunk it in and give up on the landing, right? That feeling of losing control of the aircraft is not something that we should have through any phase of this flight. And what I would like to see is, as you guys are going through working on your crosswind landings, creating your personal minimums, but then expanding that box intentionally, is looking at a crosswind landing and having that feeling in your heart that as you come in with a 12-knot crosswind, a 17-knot crosswind, or a 22-knot crosswind, whatever that might be, that this is just another landing because I have full control of the aircraft. I'm not getting pushed around by the wind. I'm flying the aircraft through the wind. When you can look at a crosswind landing and you can come in with the same exact, if we look biomedically at our heart rate, we look at the amount of adrenaline being released into our system, and we look at all of these things, it's much more difficult to fly the aircraft in a state of panic, in a state of fight or flight, than it is to stay cool in the seat as we come down to land. So as you guys go up next time, one of the things that I would like you to do is take into account maybe your heart rate, maybe your mental state as you come into land. If we're gripping the stick and we're coming in with all of this nervous energy, we can call it, the landing's probably not going to go very well because our fine motor skills are going out the window. We're not able to fly the aircraft at that 5 to 7 degree nose up attitude as our wheels come down and touch the ground, right? As we're coming in, as I'm talking about this and getting a little bit ahead of myself, as we're coming into land in a crosswind, if we have a feeling of, man, here comes a crosswind, I think I can do this, we should really be asking ourselves, is this a crosswind that I should be landing in? If every time we come in for a crosswind landing, we have that feeling, that's a really good sign that it's time to call up your flight instructor and say, hey, I know it's blowing to 20 out there. I know it's blowing to 25 or even 30 knots. That's as much wind as you can fly here at Independence Aviation without talking to Bob Shank first and getting a waiver for that. If you're flying in up to 30 knots of wind and the whole time that you're going through, even with your instructor, you're gripping the stick and you're feeling like you're out of control. If you feel like you're out of control, it's going to lead you to get out of control. As we talk about these landings and crosswinds and energy management and all of this, what I want you to think about is, if I were to come in a 15-knot crosswind, would that feel in my heart of hearts exactly the same as coming in land and no wind at all? And if the answer is, well, no, it's a crosswind, you have something that you can then work on. You have something that you can strive for, because that feeling of coming into a crosswind and picking a runway with the appropriate approach lighting system as opposed to the one that has the better winds, when you're coming in to an airport and it's easier to get off at this runway than this runway, but oh well, there's a crosswind. That's not the way that we want to be thinking. We want to be able to land the aircraft in a crosswind, outside of a crosswind, having full authority to the aircraft the whole way through. As you guys are going through and you're practicing your landings, or as you're just landing and taking into account the way that you are feeling about going into land, if your anxiety is raised, let's get you in with an instructor. Let's get you landing like a pro, as opposed to flying your aircraft with a feeling of, God, I hope this works. Okay? So as we come through and I talk about all of these things, a couple things that I want to point out here, and I'm going to speed this up to 4 times speed. As we're looking at this approach, we're looking at our vertical speed and we're looking at our airspeed. Once again, that's the depletion of our potential energy and the depletion of our kinetic energy. As the aircraft comes in, we see the nose come up, and this is going to loop through a couple times as it's sped up. You're going to see on the left, our airspeed, our kinetic energy decrease as we get rid of our potential energy, landing the lowest possible energy state possible. Now, one of the things that I hear from other instructors that I'm not a huge fan of is, oh, you should hear the stall warning horn before you touch down. And while that can be a good thing, one of the important things to note, we go up when we practice our power off stalls or our landing stalls in order to prepare us for this landing phase of flight. We do want to touch down with the least amount of energy possible. And if we bring our nose up to the critical angle of attack, we will stall. If we bring our nose up to 5 degrees nose up and we have that stall warning horn go off, we know that we're landing in a low energy state, but it's not necessary for us to land. And one thing that I want to clarify is that we are not stalling as we land. We're flying our aircraft to the ground, and the mains are touching the runway just above that stalling speed, just before the time that we reach our critical angle of attack, right? If we come in with the kinetic energy low enough and we increase our angle of attack to about 5 degrees nose up, those mains should touch down and our momentum should pull us forward at the slowest possible speed, but we should be able to maintain control, keeping that nose wheel off the ground as we roll through. And a lot of you are sitting here, I imagine, I don't know, because you're not talking to me in the question and answer section. But I imagine what a lot of you guys are thinking is, well, yeah, I mean, that's a lot easier said than done. I've been trying to do this, and my landings just get clunky sometimes, or sometimes I feel like I'm losing control for a second as I touch down, and I don't really know why this is happening. The key to flying an airplane that a lot of us instructors talk about without really talking about is, as you're going through your initial training and you're going through your instrument training, we say fly the airplane. Especially when you start to get behind, that's a great time for us to say, hey, fly the airplane, right? I'm sitting here right now saying fly the airplane to the ground, don't actually land it, right? And what are we talking about? When in visual conditions, when you hear your instructor say fly the airplane, or at any time that gong in the back of your head goes off and you say, man, I'm behind, I need to fly the airplane, what are we actually saying to do? And once again, I make this statement unfounded, and it's not in a book anywhere. This is just, we'll call it an Ianism, right? But every time I tell somebody to fly an airplane, anytime your instructor tells you to fly the airplane, the first thing that we're expecting you to do is look outside if you're in visual conditions, or do an instrument scan if you're in instrument conditions. So as I'm talking about flying the aircraft to the ground, decreasing the energy, the mechanical energy of the aircraft to the lowest possible state without stalling, what I'm saying is look out to the horizon. What I'm saying is fly the airplane. Don't try and make landing a recipe. If you come in right at 80 knots over the threshold and you pull your throttle to a certain amount and then you pitch up to 5 degrees nose up at the right time, you may be able to land the aircraft and land it pretty well 9 times out of 10. But on that 10th time, as the gust of wind comes, increases the amount of lift that your wing is creating and balloons you up. Are you then still going to be able to fly the airplane to the ground with a recipe? Right? This is why the robots can't yet land the aircraft 100% of the time, is because landing is not a recipe. We're not coming in and doing exactly, we have SOPs, and I want you guys coming in at 80 knots and pitch and power settings are good. I want you doing all those things, but what I want you thinking about more than that is, how do I maintain positive control of this aircraft all the way to the stop? The answer to that is by looking out at the horizons. The horizons, I guess if you're landing multiple times, you see the same horizon multiple times. Never mind. Horizon. As you're going through and you're doing this, there are a couple different things that you can do, exercises to improve your landings. Okay. First and foremost is come in at airspeed, right? If we have too much kinetic energy as we try and touch down, we're going to float down the runway. And there is nothing wrong with floating down the runway, depleting that kinetic energy, except for running out of runway. One of the things that you can do is, if you go up to Greeley you can land a little long so that you can feel out where is the lowest possible energy state. And this isn't just for student pilots learning to land. This is for everybody. Whether you take an instructor or not is up to you, but if you're going to try new things and land long, I would probably recommend taking a flight instructor with you. Go up to Greeley, request a long landing here at Centennial, and just fly the airplane and fly it and fly it and fly it a foot above the runway until you get to that 5 degrees nose up. What you're going to find in the piston is we have to keep pulling in order to keep the nose at 5 degrees. Okay. For those of you flying the Vision Jet, what you're going to find is you pull that nose to 5 degrees nose up, and if you're pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling, you get the nose to go 5 degrees, 7 degrees, maybe even 10 degrees nose up as you touch down. A little bit different landing because you're in a heavier aircraft. But as you're going through and you're touching down in a piston, you have to keep pulling and pulling and pulling in order to keep that nose up because of the big heavy engine that's sitting up front. We're not pulling and pulling and pulling and keeping that nose coming up. We're just pulling to keep the nose at 5 degrees. Landing stalls are a good way to practice that. When you're doing your landing stalls, make sure that you're looking at the horizon, not looking at your instruments. Okay. Another thing that you can go out and practice that's really good for your landings are soft field takeoffs. We're controlling the aircraft at the lowest possible energy state while it's increasing. But what you're going to see if you're looking at the horizon is you're pitching for about that 5 degrees nose up. You're maintaining your rudder, and if there's any crosswind, you're maintaining your ailerons while the wheels are running across the ground. It's going to encourage you to look at the horizon if you're not already in order to fly. Once again, I don't recommend going out and doing a soft field takeoff for the first time in a long time. I recommend that you go with an instructor if that's something that you want to do. Lastly, and this one does require an instructor, what you can do is keep control of the stick. You're going to keep control of all of your flight surfaces. However, what you're going to do is give controls of the throttle to your instructor. Your instructor will then take care of a lot of the airspeed management, or I should say, will take care of the thrust changes to the aircraft as you're coming into land. And then what you get to focus on is just the flying of the aircraft. As you do this exercise, what your instructor wants to do is have you keep flying and landing a little bit long as they go through and they pull out the power. It's going to allow you to find where that runway is. As you're looking out at the horizon, instead of down at any of your instruments, and instead of trying to get the airplane on the ground already, they're going to keep you flying above the ground at a foot or two, and then we'll either pull the throttle to idle if you're looking like you're in a good landing position, or they'll push that throttle forward and just keep you flying along the runway, and then instead of doing a touch and go, you're doing a low pass. Like I said, that's one that you cannot do without your instructors, so make sure that you call them up and just work on flying the aircraft and keep flying and keep flying and keep flying. What your instructor will do when you land is just pull the throttle out, and what you'll find is you're going to bring that nose up to 5 degrees, and you're going to fly and fly, and you're going to say, oh my God, I found it. I found where I should be in a landing attitude. Then they'll pull the throttle back. And instead of then going and panicking and pulling up or doing anything else, you're just going to keep doing what you're doing. Keeping that nose at 5 degrees, your wheels will kiss the ground, and you're really going to get to see what those landings are supposed to feel like. For those of you learning to land, these are good exercises. For those of you who are feeling pretty good about your landings, but every once in a while you come in a little bit punky or a little bit off, and you're going through and debriefing and going, man, why did that happen? These are great exercises for you guys to do to make sure that not 6 out of 10 times, not 9 out of 10 times you're landing the aircraft well, but 99 times out of 100, you're landing the aircraft well and with intention. Now, this is in no way saying that I land the aircraft well every time, that your instructors land the aircraft well every time. We all get in those moments where flying the aircraft, something unexpected happens. We have to change things up. It's not a recipe for a perfect landing, but it's going to give you the wherewithal that after every time you touch down, instead of going, man, that was so firm, what did I do wrong? You're going to think back, you're going to be looking at the horizon, and in your mind's eye, you're going to say, I should have pulled the throttle back a little bit later. I should have increased my angle of attack. I should have, could have, would have. Okay. As we talk about landings, this is another one that I really like. the reason that I pulled up this video is not just because he's very, very coolly, very, I don't know, well, it's pretty cool. It's only my whole job to talk once again. But what he did was he stitched together a camera in the nose of the aircraft as well as a camera so that you can see him. What I want you to focus on is see how much that stick moves as he's coming in this crosswind. But as you look at the runway sight picture and the nose of the aircraft is pointed at his aiming point the entire time. As he transitions his eyes up, you still see that stick moving, and he's working really hard. But as we look at the sight picture, we see a little bit of rocking, right? We see a little bit of nose up and nose down, but as we're coming in on an approach, what we're talking about is keeping the aircraft headed in a, most of the time, 3-degree line directly down to the runway. As this loops and we watch it one more time, watch the stick move and how much he's having to do with his throttle, with his stick, and watch how much the nose moves relative to the runway. Think about if you were flying your Cirrus and you're coming down to the runway, if you were to make stick movements like that in no wind at all, what would that aircraft be doing? You'd be making everybody sick, and that's the point. The wind isn't flying the aircraft down to the ground. You're maintaining positive aircraft control. And the way that he's able to do this, to keep his nose from bouncing all over the place, right, is he's putting in those movements so that the rest of the aircraft somewhat rotates around the nose. And that energy state, as you're coming in and bleeding that energy off to land in the lowest possible energy state, is coming in, and all of those stick movements that you're making are to keep the energy of the aircraft headed, no matter what angle it's in, no matter what wind you're in, coming down to the 1,000-foot markers. Okay? Any questions about that? Great. So this is where we do a little bit of the stuff that's not as fun to talk about because it's numbers. And it's the FAA. I hope nobody from the FAA is watching. Right. This is stabilized approach criteria published by the FAA safety team. What's funny about this is it simply talks about your descent to the runway, right? That descent angle, the glide path angle. And this is the way that the FAA described it for a long time, is just a stabilized approach is keeping your energy going on a single path down to the runway. Okay. They recommend a 3-degree glide slope, and they recommend no more than 1,000 foot per minute. Okay. The 3-to-1 rule to determine your own is more math if you want to do math. Really what we're talking about, if you can load an approach and fly the glide slope or the glide path, even when doing a visual approach, great. If you're a student pilot or a private pilot only, using your PAPIs, using your VASIs, using that visual guidance to keep you coming in at the appropriate angle that's going to keep you clear of terrain. Okay. So as we talk about this stabilized approach and we think about all the things that we've discussed tonight, we're thinking about how the aircraft is coming down to the runway and what the energy looks like. The more that the aircraft moves off of that localizer and glide slope or off of that PAPI, right, the more that we change, the more that we're throwing variables into our landing that we then have to compensate with skill. As we look at stabilized approach criteria, the FAA later published in AC 120-108, they have a little bit more to say about what is a stabilized approach. They say that you're fully configured on speed, on power, and on flight path by the final approach fix, or that you're stabilized by 1,000 feet if you're doing a visual approach. For us who fly VFR, 1,000 feet isn't a great idea to be on glide path when we're in a traffic pattern. So really what I want you to encourage to look at is 500 feet. Less than 1,000 feet on an instrument approach, less than 500 feet on a visual approach, we should be stabilized, which means configured on speed, on power, on flight path. Okay. As we're coming in on these approaches, for a lot of us, I would ask you, is this your approach, right? If not friend, why friend shaped? He's got fuzzy listeners and a boopable snoot, right? A lot of times as we come through and we're on our approach, we're saying, yeah, this is good enough. Yeah, I can fix this. Yeah, this is fine. And that works for us a lot. A lot of us have heard Mike Goulian talk about the normalization of deviant behavior, right? For those of you who haven't heard of the normalization of deviant behavior, we do something and get away with it, so then we think it's going to work the next time and the next time. When we read about aircraft crashes in Pilatus or TBM and they crash 600 pounds over max gross, I guarantee you the pilot didn't wake up one day and say, hey, let's load this thing up 600 extra pounds. Usually that comes with a 50 pounds, then 100 pounds, and then you get to the point where you're not really doing weight and balance, right? The same thing is happening to us with our approaches. Another way that I can put this for most of you successful Cirrus pilots and owners is that unstabilized approaches are sunk costs, right? We get so invested in doing it right the first time. We fall in love with the idea of, man, I can fix this. If your approach isn't stable, I encourage you to just go around, because it works and it works and it works and it works until it doesn't. And that ends in eventually, for some of us and not all of us, getting used to saving approaches to not being stabilized ends in catastrophe. And I encourage you to make the go around a part of your normal operating procedures and your normal training. Now, this is going to be more of a teaser than anything else. This is the old go-around. We cram, we climb, we clean, we cool, we call, right? As we go around, what we think about is getting away from the earth as quickly as possible. Cramming in the power, setting a climb, getting the flaps up, taking a breath, and then making a call. As we look at our IFOM, as we look at our procedures in our POH and AFM for how we should do a go around, this is the way that it's set up. We put the power in, we initiate a climb, we get the flaps up. What I want you guys thinking about as we think about go arounds is putting the throttle forward, leveling the nose to arrest the descent, to arrest our descent, to arrest the descent, accelerating to 77 knots. Then we initiate the climb. Then we put our flaps up. So many Cirrus accidents specifically that are heartbreaking to watch are because the flaps go up before it is time during the go around. Please, please, please think about your go around once again in the same way that we think about our landings. Not with a, oh God, I got to do a go around. Not with a big adrenaline rush and that you're in some hurry to get things done. You're just flying the aircraft. If we make a decision to go around at 500 feet because we're not stable, most of the time that's a lot less adrenaline inducing than being only 5 feet above the runway or after the first or, God forbid, second bounce. But what I want you guys to think about as you're doing your go-around, as you're practicing your go-arounds, is that you are in full control of the aircraft and that you're just flying. Doing a go-around, even in mountainous terrain that we are so close to, doing a go-around at Steamboat or Buena Vista or even Aspen, should not be an adrenaline-filled event. It should just be maintaining positive control of the aircraft. You have the ability to take off from that runway. You therefore have the ability to start in an energized state with the kinetic energy to get airflow over the wings to just overfly the runway. Then once you are flying again, not descending, not climbing, not stalling, but flying the aircraft over the runway, you can think about rotating. Then, once airspeed is appropriate, we can put our flaps to 50. Then, once airspeed is appropriate, we can put our flaps up. Now, I say this is a teaser not just because I'm not going to talk about it anymore, but also because we're going to wait for Cirrus to come out with their new AFM updates that's going to reflect the way that they want us thinking about and doing go-arounds. There's also going to be a new maneuver in the maneuvers guide. I'll give you one guess at what you're going to be doing at 2,000 feet instead of 5 feet above the runway. Our next Proficiency Club meeting is March 10th because it's the second Tuesday of the month. How funny that February and March both fall on the 10th. I didn't do it, but easy to remember, so I'll expect to see you all there. I want to thank you guys for coming. Next month, we're going to be talking about the autopilot. A lot of times as we make inputs on the autopilot, we're once again sitting there kind of crossing our fingers, or we're kind of watching it and going, is it going to turn too fast? Is it going to turn too slow? Let's, just as I talk about taking control of your landings and your go-arounds, let's take full control of the autopilot so that there's never a time that you think it's going to climb and it descends. Thanks again, guys. We'll see you soon.